Hi, I'm Lee Milan. In this video, we're going to look at sequencing drum samples in arrangement view. So there's various different strategies for dealing with drums, and this one in particular is about predominantly using one-shot audio samples, maybe taking some one-shots from actual loops themselves, and then getting used to kind of the workflow and features of Ableton Live to effectively create some rhythmic parts on the grid of arrangement view. So your starting point really is obviously set your tempo based on what style of music you want to go for, and then kind of zone in to what it is you want to work on in terms of a musical measure. So it might make sense to start at one bar. So if you just highlight the first bar there and do Command and L, go over the timeline and just zoom into that area. We're not doing MIDI, so let's just highlight those two tracks and hit backspace to get rid of them. And let's start with a backbone drum beat. So I'm going to go to samples, and I'm just going to type in the word kick and see what's in the library. Okay, that one has a nice beginning to it. So let's just drag that in as my first sample. Now it's incredibly long. It's not a well sort of edited tight file there. So let's just pull that right in terms of the end of the clip there. And that will just hide a large portion of the file. Now, if you're seeing something different, if you're dragging in a file and you're seeing this kind of a thing, or you're finding that when you drag in your samples, it's softer in tone than it was when you're actually auditioning it, there's a preference you need to change. If we go to preferences here and go to record, warp and launch, this option here called create fades on clip edges automatically adds a fade. So if I grab another sample there and bring it in, you'll notice that sample has actually got a fade at the beginning. So watch out for that. Make sure that that's disabled in this case. So I'm just going to do the quick way of turning that off again. Command and comma to bring up preferences. Then go to create fades on clip edges and just turn it off. Another option that can be quite useful in general is to turn off the auto warp long samples. So if we're grabbing anything that's a particularly long file, we prefer to deal with it in its raw form rather than being brought to the correct tempo of our project and so on, we can disable that as well. So let's start our sequence here. And I am bringing the actual end of this drum sample prematurely before it rests at the 0 position in the middle of the waveform. So I'm going to create a little fade to avoid any clicks at the end of that sample. So a couple of ways I can start sequencing. I can Alt and drag, and as long as my grid's enabled, I can drop it where I want, and then I've created my next part of the rhythm. Or as long as it's highlighted, I can do Command and D, and I can drag, or I can use the arrow keys and put it in the right position on the grid as well. So I'm starting with a drum and bass tempo, so I'm going to go for a drum and bass beat today. And then I want to add a snare to this in a minute. So let's just have a quick listen to the character of this. Just pull the volume down a little bit, because cumulatively, when these sounds start playing together, we're going to start peaking our master. And let's have a look at snare drums. Okay, I like the solidity of the kick drum at the moment. It's got quite a lot of timbre and character to it. So I don't feel like I want to layer any samples to make my kick drum sound different. I'm happy with it as it is. But when it comes to the snare drum, I might want to layer samples. So there's a couple of things to think about here. First, what combination of samples, based on what you're auditioning, might work well together. I've got one sample here, which is a side stick. It's got a nice transient to it, but it's not got a long decay to it. And then I have this longer decayed, if I just turn the preview off for a minute, I've got a longer decayed version of a snare where there's a nice timbre to it and room to it as well. So a combination of that side stick and this longer acoustic snare might work really well. So I'm going to get my side stick sample first and drag that in and place that to the positions relevant for this style of music. So on the 2nd and the 4th beat. And let's just see what that sounds like. So I'm just going to zoom in and make this a bit easier for me to see. If I want to see everything that I've currently got in better focus, I can highlight the portion and press the Z key. It'll bring it right up. And then I can always press X and go back from that point as well. So let's zoom in for a minute and let's see what this sounds like. that's the kind of rhythm I want to work with today. So my snare's in position. Let's go and grab the other snare and place it underneath the one that I wanted to work on, this one here. So it's a different way of changing the duration of the sample. I can zoom out or scroll to the right now and try and grab the end of that clip, or I can just roughly judge where I think the end of the actual sample gets to a point where we can't hear it anymore, and use the Command and E command, which is called split, and then just remove the portion I don't need anymore. And let's just see what these two samples sound like together. Now at the moment they're at 0 decibels, so combined they're going to go above 0 decibels, and I'm going to get a peak on my mix bus. So I'm just going to highlight the two with a shift key and then pull that down in volume. So let's just copy that sample across with the Alt command this time to go alongside my other layer. And let's now individually balance this. The click is actually kind of overshadowed by that acoustic layer, so let's pull that down. In fact, let's pull it all the way down and then blend it in once we've adjusted ourselves to that transient layer. Okay, so that's sounding good so far. Let's see if there's another character we can add with this snare as well. That's quite a nice lower fundamental, so let's experiment with that alongside our other snare sound. And again, it's going to be loud if we just have it at 0, so let's just pull that down and let's combine it with the other layers as well. Okay, that's an interesting combination of acoustic timbre, a side stick for a nice mid-range transient, and then a lower thuddy snare for a lower bit of weight to it as well. But if we zoom right in to our waveforms here, we can see there's a very different relationship of the fundamental frequency of this sound and the fundamental frequency of this sound and the fundamental frequency of this sound. So the fundamental is going to be the longer waveform. You see all the frequencies that account for the timbre, which are the small deviations of the actual waveform wiggling up and down. But the key main waveform that runs through is our fundamental. And you can see the alignment of this one is in a different stage of going up when the other one's going down. And what happens when we combine our signals is they end up being either a combination of being louder if they're both going up at the same time, or if they're at different positions of going up and different positions of going down. We can end up with either some cancellation fully or some partial reduction in volume at those particular frequencies. So what I'm getting to here is the idea of auditioning whether this going up at this time is the best combination with these two layers, or whether this going down and doing a mirror image might be a better combination. So we can use what's called utility, drag that onto one of our layers, and do what's called a phase reverse. Phase is the current position of up or down of a waveform. And instead of it going up, where it does on the actual image, it's just flipping it like a picture upside down, so it will go down instead. So we can audition it with no phase adjustment, and then we can audition it with what we call 180 degrees of phase adjustment, which is it folded upside down, flipped upside down. So let's have a listen to it one way up and then the other, and decide the best combination of these sounds. Okay, for this layer, it's very, very minor, but that one sounds like a better combination, but these are 3 layers happening right now. So I'm actually gonna just copy the actual setting of this device and try it on my other layer. And then let's try which orientation, either 0 degrees or the flip to 180 degrees, is the best combination of this layer with the other. Okay, hopefully you can hear that, is that lower frequency is currently a lot more pronounced when it's in 180 degrees rotation. If I actually just grab How can we do this? We just group these sounds first. So we highlight them all and group them. Grouping basically lets them all run into a little mixing channel of their own. So they're combined separately before they go to the main mix that we hear together. And if I add an EQ8 here, we can look at what the sound's doing. So at the moment, this is our normal polarity. And we have a look at it on here. And that's our fundamental, at least our loudest lower peak. And then if we go back and we flip the reverse of that, we have a look. It's a more certain peak that's down in this part here. So if your ears aren't hearing it, hopefully when you look at it, you can see where there's a slight difference in terms of that combination of those layers. So now we have a kick and a snare layer. Let's have a look at adding in an actual loop and editing that to work within our arrangement. So I've got some percussive loops here. So let's open this up and let's see what we got. That's got an interesting texture to it. So if I drag that in to the track here, I'll just zoom out and position that correctly. And just bring that down in volume. What's happened, if I double click that, is it's already scanned the file. It's 130 BPM, and I can confirm that's correct because the file name has that in there too. And then it's adjusted the playback speed of this to fit what's going on right now. So if I play it straight away, it'll sound in keeping with the rhythm. I mean, that sounds great to start with. What it is at the moment is it's maintaining the pitch of the drums, but making them fit over a much faster BPM than it's written at. So it's written at 130 and now it's playing them at a faster rate at 172, but it's preserving the pitch. So it's actually doing quite a lot of maths to do that at the moment. If we want to make it have a more old school behavior, which we call vary speed, if we go into the warp mode, we can go to repitch mode, and then you'll hear it immediately go a lot higher. I think in this context, that sounds better than the other option did. It's putting it into the much higher frequencies. And what we can do is quite easily just chop our loop, we zoom in, find some points that we want to chop it at, and then use that Command-E split command that we used to tidy up one of those snare layers earlier on. And this way we can just kind of go in there and reorder some of these slices. I think that open hi-hat might work better towards the end, so I'll just drag and drop that there. And I think that more frantic, thinner hi-hat might work better there as well, so let's try that out. It seems to unify itself way better with that snare pattern now as well. So we've imported a loop, we've chosen how it behaves to actually get it to the tempo, whether it maintains the original pitch of the sample, or whether we go for like a record turntable, speeding it up to make it faster, where the pitch goes up, or slowing it down to make it go slower and the pitch goes down. So it's a much more natural, real-world behavior of playing back. The other thing I've noticed with this particular loop is the actual balance of the signal is much louder on the left-hand side. So we have a panorama control here where we can just change the balance of the left and right channels. And make that way more centralized in terms of being equal in volume for the left and right speakers. So we've got a loop loaded in there, a kick drum and a snare. Let's now actually just try and take a slice from a loop itself. And for that, I'm going to go to some more classic break sounds. And let's just have a look at what we got here. There's some nice short hi-hats within that loop that I want to kind of single out and work with. So let's have a look at how we can edit from a larger loop and just use it as a one shot. So I'm going to grab that in again and drop it into my grid. And I think it'll be one of these here. I'll just solo it out to make sure. Yeah, it sounds like one of those there. So I'm going to Command and E once I've highlighted it, delete the unnecessary parts here, and just double click to bring up the actual sample editor down here. Now, if you have a look at the sample itself, you can see the actual timing, because this was a break that's not necessarily perfect in its timing on a quantized grid. When I edited it there on the grid, the position isn't quite at the beginning. So what I can do is just move that start marker to an earlier position. The position at the beginning of the clip hasn't moved on the grid here, just the content has been what we call slipped. We slipped the actual content. So now I can have a go at sequencing this. So I've got a hi-hat pattern. Let's hear it in context with everything else, and let's watch our volume levels. So I think maybe like an offbeat might work well here. Maybe skip the one where the snare's playing, otherwise they're kind of fighting for space. Let's see how that sounds. Okay, so this is the pattern so far. If you want to make it more like it's a collection of samples, something that has a bit more movement, because we have taken a small snippet of a break, just repeated it again and again, we can go in and we can use those envelopes that we discovered earlier on, down here, and change these. If you don't see these, by the way, it's probably because your automation is enabled here, which can be done via the automation button, or we can press the A key to do that too. So watch out for that if you're not seeing what you expect to see here. But I can kind of tighten these up by changing the curve of these hi-hats. And if I do that to just 2 of them, just visually for speed's sake at this point, I can go and copy these across the position of the other ones, so we have, again, a bit more variation to what's going on. So there's 2 different sounds, or 2 different versions of the same sound, sorry. Now, other things we can change here. If I highlight them all and take them out of warp mode, and I choose to transpose it, if I'm in warp mode, if I just go step back for a minute, if I'm in warp mode and I transpose these sounds up, you hear they sound a bit strange because they're still trying to keep time and pitch separate, and we're not using what we call that vary speed behavior. So if I instead return that back to 0 and turn warp off, it will make these samples transpose in the same way. They'll go higher and faster, or slower and lower. And this is a good way of trying to preserve the most natural sense of the drum when you're pitching it up or down. So now we have a bit of envelope change and we have some pitch change over time as well. Let's have a listen to that. Okay, I mean, just a couple of simple layers there, and that's sounding like quite a good drum beat. So let's have a look at a couple more options before we tie this up. So my snare drum was grouped. Mainly we did it so we could look at it, but they are associated layers of sound. So it's a good idea to group them together for a few reasons. One, workflow is improved, so we know where things belong. So if I actually go in and rename my drums, so that group is the snare. My kick drum is alone, so I can just choose to rename that as my kick. So I'm using Command and R there to just quickly rename that. I would say this is my main kind of loop. So let's label that as main loop. And this is my hi-hat source. Even though it's from a loop, it's turned into just being a hi-hat one shot. Now what I can do is if I want to process these things as a whole, but I still want to have other instrumentation in this project, like basses and instruments and so on, I can choose to group these. So another generation of grouping. My snare layers are grouped, but every other track is separate, and then they all get combined together in the main mix. So if I group these before that main mix, it gives me a chance to process the drums as a whole before they reach the main mix, and I'm not processing other instruments I might bring in later. So I'm going to go to Group Tracks, and then name this again as my drum bus. Another word for group. So now all of my drums are running through here, and we can see that through the level meter there. And that gives us another level of deciding to process and manipulate our sounds. So I'm not going to go over the top here. I'm just going to show you the actual the application possibilities with this. So it could be I go to audio effects and I load in the pre kind of designed device, which is the drum bus, and put it on my drums. I'm just going to actually back the input level off a little bit because it tends to distort straight away if we're at quite a high level. And then I'm going to just try and make it sound a little bit more what we call glued together by processing this in a way that it will bring all those sounds in a more combined way, using a combination of compression and saturation, so distortion and level adjustments. So what we've done here is we've looked at using one-shot samples, ways that we can manipulate them using fades, their start position and tidying them up, how we can re-pitch them, and how the warp behaviors can affect what goes on when we re-pitch them as well. We've also looked at how we can take a loop and either rework it by slicing it up and then reordering the parts, or editing and taking one part out of a loop as a nice texture to add in alongside our existing drums. Finally, we've looked at the grouping process, whether it's for single layers to make one sound or all of the kit, and be able to produce a coherent sound by group level processing of the drums.